Okay, hello and welcome to the very first tutorial of one of many coming to refresh you a little bit on some of the skills we learned in Microsoft Access. So the first lesson that we have to talk about today is how to get your data from an Excel spreadsheet, which is a pretty common thing, into Microsoft Access 2013. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, I am working on Windows 8, the newest edition, as well as Excel 13 and Access 13, which by now you should be all doing that, seeing as we're in 2015 now. So what I want to talk to you about is how to get this data from from Excel into Access. So step number one, as you all should know, is that you can't just import data into a database and expect it to work. All great database design starts with data normalization. Now, the good news is we don't have time to talk about data normalization today. So I'm going to go through and break this data down and normalize it along the way. And that would be a different lesson on how I do that for a different day. But what I do want you to pay attention to are the rules and best practices to make sure that you have a clean data import into Microsoft Access. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is normalize this data. So let me just quickly tell you what you're looking at. This is a generic data set, just like we used in class, for a Redbox-esque movie rental company and or Blockbuster or whatever's popular. So let's go with Redbox, all right? We've got the date that movies are rented, who rented it, right? First, last, and account number. The movie serial number that they rented, which would be the primary key for what we're going to go into in just a minute. Movie title and the release date. Okay, now you know that the first level of normalization, first normal form, requires several different things. So we're going to do all of that now to get this imported into Access correctly. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to break this big data table into three, smaller normalized tables. So we're going to have customer table, inventory table, transactions table. Then we're going to go through, we're going to set up the relationships between those and activate our database. So what we're going to do first, so we're going to copy this data. We're going to move it to its own particular tab. So business practice number one. First business practice that you really want to pay attention to when you're importing data from Excel into Access is you want to make sure that each set of data that you want to import into a table is on its own individual tab inside that Excel worksheet. It will make your life easier. Do you have to do that? No. There's another way. I won't say it's a better way, but you can do it by defining a set as a data table, which is probably more than you want to get into right now. So let's try this and see what we can do. So first of all, let's quickly remove the redundant data that we don't need for the customer table. So we don't need the date. We don't need serial, movie title, release date. We're going to get rid of all of these things like so. We also need to remove the duplicates. Now, all of these things are not the point of this lesson today, so you should already know how to do that. And what I want you to pay attention to is what we're going to do once we get this actually normalized. So the first thing, business practices, you need to make sure that each individual worksheet is for each individual table in your database. And by now you should have a data dictionary created, so you know how to do that. Next thing you want to pay attention to is you want to make sure your data is clearly labeled. Right? First name, last name, account number. Those are going to be the actual column field headings when we go in and import this into Access. You also want to make sure you know what the primary key field should be for each individual table that you import. And in this particular case, it's going to be column C. And you lastly want to make sure that there are no gaps anywhere when you're importing the data from this sheet. So what do I mean by gaps? I mean this. So if I have something down here, what's going to happen is Access is going to import row 21 as an orphan record, and that is bad. Orphan records will stop your database from working. Why? Because there's no primary key field entered in for this blank row, and you should know by now the primary key cannot be null. All right, so that's another rule. You want to make sure there are no gaps in your data. You want to remove those gaps. Next thing that it'll do you a solid is if you make sure that your data starts in cell A1, because if it doesn't, well, you know what you've got? You got another gap there, don't you? So when you import that data in, it very well could look like a blank field, and that could cause some troubles. So let me quickly recap. Make sure your data starts in cell A1 of the worksheet for the specific table that you want to import. Make sure that your duplicate data is all gone. Make sure that there are no gaps in your data. Okay. It's also a good business practice, although you can get around it, to make sure that your data is formatted correctly in Access or in Excel before you import it into access, and I'll show you that in just a minute. So let me go ahead and jump into inventory. I guess I got to copy my data again. Jump into inventory. So I can go up to A1. And let's get rid of that duplicate stuff again. So we don't need this. And we want to take those duplicates out. Okay. And we want to make sure we know what the primary key field is. And in that case, it's going to be serial number. That's the field that does not repeat. Okay. And in this case, everything is good. All right. So the very last thing that we're going to import, and I'll show you how we want to get this formatted, even though it's already formatted correctly, is transactions. Now in the transactions field, we're going to get rid of these. We're going to get rid of these. We don't really need those things, as you'll learn when you go through normalization. But we want to make sure that the date is actually formatted as a date, because if we do that in Excel, and right now it's a custom date, but whichever date you choose, you could just use short date, for example. It was a custom date before. They'll all work either way. Okay, it will work out better for you. You won't have to go through and spend time doing that in Access. All right. So these three fields are going to be concatenated keys, right? So date, account, and serial together will be the primary key for the transactions table. So in this particular case, we are set to go. So the data is set up and ready to be imported into Access. So let me recap one more time. We're going to shut this recording off. I'll give you a chance to try this on your own, and we'll reconvene. So it goes like this one more time. First, your data needs to be normalized. Second, you need to make sure that each individual table that you want to import is on its own worksheet within the workbook. All right. You want to make sure there are no gaps in your data, right? So we don't want anything floating around down here. You want to make sure that nothing is touching your data. You want to make sure that your data is formatted in the correct number format before you import, although you can get around it. It's a good business practice. All right. And you also want to make sure your data starts in cell A1. At this point, you need to save your document. Okay. You need to save it and you need to close it. You cannot import until the data that you're importing is closed. So we're going to go ahead and do a save as here. I'm going to save this to my desktop. I'll call it Redbox Import Example. And I'm going to close this down, and we'll reconvene in just a few.